Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. I hope you enjoy. Story number 1. Pluto has fallen, written by British Tea Company. Sensing that they were close to the Pluto colony, Captain Warren rose from his seat and made way for the cockpit, built to accommodate 3 full squads. The dropship's passengers' bays felt almost lonely with just one. Having long accustomed to standing in steps that were in motion, the captain found little issue with his short sojourn, earning a wary glance from both the pilot and the co-pilot as he stepped into their personal cubbyhole. The pair voiced their objections silently, for Pluto colony was already in visual range. The sight of the colony's dome featuring such a gaping hole that could be seen from several miles away boded ill for the possibility of survivors. Colony's been dark for 16 hours. I see no power readings, which means no life support. Survivors are possible, though. I won't lie, Captain. Not likely, the pilot said as he glanced back up. Though, I'll admit, I don't like the idea of leaving anyone behind, even if their chances aren't great. I'm a bit more concerned about what caused that hole, Warren said as he glanced at the breach that would have been easily large enough to accommodate a ship 3 times the size of the one he was riding in. Whether it's a freak accident or terrorists, we need to at least make sure the brass know about how this happened. There was a brief pause in his speech as he gave a slight dry chuckle. On the brighter side, we don't need to ask anyone's permission to enter. Bring us in, we'll get a clear view of what happened from there. A nod came from the pilot as the dropship decelerated to a more manageable velocity, though the hole in question was more than large enough to accommodate. A potential collision could probably chip the paint of their hull, or worse yet, disrupt their cloak. When wandering into an unknown situation like this, it was better to be discreet. After all, there was a non-zero possibility they were landing in the aftermath of a terrorist attack. The team was deployed just near the site of the breach. The cloak of the dropship shimmered just a bit as 10 figures landed into Ghost Town before them. An eerie silence pervaded the area before them as Andrew, the team's engineer, took out his PDA and pointed it at the hole as though aiming a gun. Forensics calculations determined the breach's origin came from outside the colony. Plausible weaponry, not a chance in hell that it was done with IEDs. Repeated blasts from lower-yield cannons, maybe, someone offered. Not a chance. This was done in one hit. Whomever came here brought some serious firepower to bear. That boded ill. Even these smaller domes were designed to survive against anything short of a direct hit from a nuclear missile. If insurgents had gotten their hands on a plasma cannon large enough to breach a colony dome, that meant they likely had gotten their hands on a fully capable battleship. That meant that insurrections that had thought to have been ended months ago wasn't quite dead, as the brass would believe. At least, with the damage identified, they could sweep for survivors or culprits. Stick together, Warren said as he glanced around, rifle at the ready, his fingers strumming a rhythm with every breath he took. If some rebels have gotten their hands on capital-class weaponry, that absolutely came in force. Best case scenario, they've left it ready, and maybe there's someone still alive to shed light on the situation. If not... His voice trailed off as his suit's interface began to rapidly flash warning signals, and in an instant they saw the horde. It was not the throngs of rebels that they had been expecting, but a swarm of chittering creatures. He'd never been a huge fan of spiders, but seeing them the size of dogs and with glistening white fangs, Warren couldn't help but scream. His gun followed suit in an instant. The formerly still colony was abuzz with both gunfire and alien creatures. For a while, it seemed like despite the sheer number of their foes, the squad will held out. Not a single one of their foes reached them until the ground beneath them burst open in a shower of debris, and the serpentine creatures with the face of a squid came to greet them. For all of its stupefying hideousness, its presence was but a boon to the spider-like minions it commanded, and they were egged on. That was when the squad made a run for the dropship. A few guys didn't make it. Though the troopers had a significant head start, the horde overtook the slower members of their squad easily. Their muffled screams upon Pluto's unatmosphered surface was a sound Warren would never forget for the rest of his life. The mad dash through maybe what was 50 meters at most felt like an eternity. Yet relief was in sight as the dropship uncloaked and its forward-facing turrets opened fire, literally ripping apart the pursuers. He had almost made it too. Almost made it to when the serpentine alien, the squid face, took a deep breath, and from a distance that would have impressed any drill instructor, struck him square in the back with a glob of acid. He fell to the ground, his screams silent as his suit desperately tried to keep his internal systems working. The mind-numbing pain engulfed him, to the point where he didn't realize Andrew picked him up and carried him into the dropship. Warren's next memories were fleeting. He could only notice 7 other figures in the 9 that had originally come with. He felt his suit being removed off of him as Mitchell, the team's medic, fumbled into the supply container filled with medical supplies. And the last thing he remembered seeing was staring out the viewport, and in the distance seeing the lumbering mass of what looked like a ship, alien and horrifying in all of its grim expanse. "We have to warn Earth," was the last phrase he uttered before his world went dark. End of story. Jupiter Has Fallen, written by British Tea Company. Compared to the military juggernauts that form the Mars and Earth defense fleets, the Jupiter defense fleet seemed hardly worth mentioning when it came to considering the amassed naval power of mankind. Reflecting the relatively minute populations of Europa and Titan colonies, the entire Jupiter defense fleet was smaller than the Martian sub, to say nothing about what Mother Earth had at its disposal. Yet, compared to Pluto colony, which hadn't even had an established defense fleet, and then the various scattered habitats orbiting Saturn, which had less than a dozen ships to their names, Jupiter colony might as well have been a military superpower. Ever since first contact roughly 3 years ago, Jupiter had been readying itself. A defense fleet of 37 spaceships had ballooned to a proud 108. Among them, Jupiter's first battle group proudly constructed at the Europa shipyards. Rear Admiral Enrique Garcia had accepted his station aboard the JDF Spain with a proud heart. At the staggering 512 meters in length, the Spain was one of the newest generations of battleships, equipped with a new shielding technology and bristling with an array of weapons all tailored to slaying the invaders. At his back, he had 27 heavy cruisers, 30 light cruisers, and 50 destroyers, with an additional 200 escort vessels generously donated from the Martian defense fleet. The naval power of Jupiter had increased twofold. Where the aliens had previously attacked colonies barely capable of much as mustering armed resistance, this time they had a real fight. Like many of his fellow men that had read the reports on the extrasolar invaders and the callous destruction of the outer colonies, Garcia was more than eager to break the back of the invaders, and what other place to do it besides his home of Europa. And upon the surface of the 2 inhabited moons of Jupiter, the civilian population had been evacuated to Mars, a comforting thought for the elderly officer as he thought of the prospect of his grandchildren facing the threat of these vile invaders. Instead, if the aliens were to make the beeline for the surface of the 2 colonies, they would be greeted by nothing but an array of anti-orbital batteries, as well as a laser fire of over 2 million JDF soldiers. He could have mused on for hours on end as to the preparedness of his forces, but eventually battle would come. Peering over a series of screens, Commander Hill was the first to announce the battle's beginning. "Alien ships detected just at our range. Estimated contacts roughly 900 ships." A brief wave of unease washed over the bridge, and there was a palpable sense of apprehension which danced at every ship. Though many of the crew may have not experienced the dread before, Garcia himself was a veteran of the various colonial slap-fighting which had threatened to shatter humanity's unity all those decades ago. Gesturing for the Commandant Hill to step aside, the grey-haired admiral gave a confident smile as his voice projected to all channels. "Steady, man. Just remember, 1 human is worth 10 of those bastards. Those odds are in our favor, not theirs. On my command, prepare to fire, and let us smite them from the stars. And with a single word, mankind's day of wrath lit up the black of the void in an orchestra of flame. A symphony of emerald plasma and azure rays colored the void, immolating the hateful ships that plowed their way forward. Xenohusks shrieked their silent death cries into the cold vacuum of space. A few lucky survivors managed to get close enough to Titan and Europa to make their payloads to the surface. Those bioships were hunted down by the packs of fierce Martian escorts, the majority of their drop pods never even setting foot on the surface as the colonial defense ripped them apart. Beyond a few scattered fleet losses, the initial contact had left the aliens reeling. This was the comeuppance these invaders would face for their atrocities at Pluto and Saturn. This was the assembled might of humanity, when even just a fraction of itself was dedicated to its own protection. A feeling of relief washed over Rear Admiral as he took a deep breath, observing the detonations in the distance through the viewport. Minimal casualties, more contacts detected. Looks like we've got a second wave incoming, Commandant Hill said as she looked up from her station. A bit smaller than the first fleet. Hold positions! Let them come, Garcia said as he observed outside. Far beyond the range of his eyesight, a few escorts and destroyers lifelessly drifted into the endless void. Tell the damaged ships to pull back behind the lines. There's no need for unnecessary losses. With only the newest of his ships having shields, it was his duty to ensure his men's lives were preserved. These ships would do far better to absorb the brunt of the bioplasma that the enemy spewed at them in large but relatively ineffectual quantities. No sooner had the second wave of alien ships cut to pieces did Hill once again make an announcement. More contacts detected. Steady now! We'll repel them as we did the others, Garcia said. An unbidden bead of sweat slid down the back of his neck as he stepped over to Hill's station. Losses were still minimal this time around, with more escorts being lost. Yet this third fleet was almost twice the size of the first, with sensors detecting far larger vessels within its ranks. The possibility that the first two waves was merely a test of human defenses poked itself into Garcia's mind. Yet he dismissed the notion. The first fleet alone could have destroyed both Pluto and Saturn settlements without issue. They were defenseless compared to Jupiter. This new fleet was tougher than the first two combined, but still, it would only be a mere speed bump. The exchange of fire occurred this time was far more costly to the fleet. Almost 24 ships were lost in the exchange, with at least a few heavy cruisers suffering terminal damage to their hull. Yet, even as the third contact was torn apart by the human defenses, Hill made her announcement again. It was only the fourth time. Yet her words had dimmed in both volume and resolve. More contacts detected. More contacts detected. More contacts detected. Just how many times did she utter those damnable words in this battle? Garcia had lost count. Around him, the fickle tide finally turning against the JDF. One of the heavy cruisers at the forefront had detonated in a spectacular explosion, showering the bioplasma and kinetic rounds. Several ships were leaving formation, the damage sustained making it unfeasible for them to remain without being easy pickings for the aliens. His formation was falling apart. And worse still, what started as a manageable trickle had now evolved into an unending tide of drop pods that were falling upon the surface of both Titan and Europa. His own thoughts were drowned out to him by the panicked cries of his fleet. But the sounds of the battle on the surface was far worse than the cacophony of gunfire, and that distant but ever-encroaching chittering of a million aliens. And even as the battered fleet weathered the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th wave, an 8th one came, followed by a 9th. The enemies were unending, their resolve unbroken no matter the losses they took. It was madness, and some, upon the assessment of the situation, would have fallen to despair. For a brief moment, Garcia did, until he heard the panic cries of Hill and the groaning of the ship's hull, like a wounded beast. "Get everyone off the ship! Signal the Paris to allow shuttles to land! Signal the fleet to retreat!" said the Admiral, as his decision was made. The battle was lost, yet clarity had finally found him in the eye of the storm. "Maybe Cabri line for Mars. Tell them we have given the invaders a black eye, and you make sure that they're ready." With a smile, he added, "And Commandant, tell your father to give them hell if they ever get to Earth." Hill gave a no-verbal response, yet it was plain as day. The fleet would have far better chance of disengaging if someone remained behind to distract their pursuers. And what better candidate than a powerful ship capable of weathering the storm? Clenching her teeth at the prospect of losing both a valued officer and a good ship, Hill did what she was told. And as far as Garcia, he remained alone upon the bridge of the Spain, ever the man's man. He alone steered his ship into the heart of the enemy fleet. The shields, merciful in their timing, had reactivated just as his crew had evacuated, leaving him with plenty of time to buy for his men. In the distance, he saw the grim expanse of the alien fleet, so numerous that they seemed to blot out the distant stars in their unending tides. He saw the massive mothership, a lumbering 8-kilometer-long behemoth that boggled all sensibilities when one considered it was a living creature. He saw the shields flicker off and die for a final time, the hull of his proud vessel being scarred and battered as its guns grew silent, one by one. And as the prow of his ship collided with a particularly large alien bioship, claiming both it and the Spain in a magnificent detonation, Garcia's only regret was how he couldn't help the soldiers left on the surface. End of story. Mars Has Fallen, written by British Tea Company. There hadn't been any living memory of the red Martian skies until today, having long been converted to a lush world of blue like Earth. Every last human still standing on Mars finally experienced the world as their forefathers did, ashen red and choked with dust. Hector cast a rueful gaze upon the ruins around him, holding up his flare. A nearby dropship altered its course for the lone soldier. His armor was in tatters, and around him were the corpses of a significant number of aliens. Sweat, dirt, and blood caked the wary soldier as the transport finally touched down, opening its doors to reveal a single figure waiting for him. "You the only one left?" the other man asked as he gazed around. The man wore no helmet, but his combat armor insignia indicated that he was a captain. "Are you sure there are no other survivors?" Hector gave no verbal response, slumped his shoulders, and a shaking head were all the captain needed to confirm no one else had made it. Even though there was little time to spare, the two strangers shared a moment of silence together. Such a lapse in concentration could have been costly, as the chittering of the spider alien was the only thing the two had for a warning. The next thing Hector knew, the captain had shoved him aside like he was weighed nothing, and falling right into his clenched grasp was an arachnid the size of a house cat. It writhed and clawed against the man's arm, only succeeding at shredding off the gloves and revealing a hand of shining metal. The captain's expression darkened as his hand clenched around the bug. The sound of rotten fruit being crushed echoed before the transport as its twitching remains fell to the ground. Offering a hand to Hector, Captain Warren helped him to his feet as the two men entered the transport and lifted off. "I was worried no one would still be alive to pick up. At least one man is better than none," the cyborg remarked dryly as he looked at the soldier staring at his arm. "Like it. It's a good memoir of what those bugs did to me on Pluto. Thankfully, it looks like you won't be having one." The joke did little to alleviate the mood of the mostly empty transport ship. A proper view was given for both of them on the state of Mars. Once mankind's proudest achievement, the red planet was now dotted with burning buildings and the wreckage of the once mighty vessels. Human blood soaked the earth, mingling with the red dust. And yet, to think, for all the toll that had been paid, the Martians had to flee from the proud little rock they called home. There was at least a silver lining to this. There were ships that finally left atmosphere. Hector could see from outside the viewport the remnants of the Martian defense fleet. Remnants was perhaps a poor choice of word. Bulks were probably described as far better, as what was still the vast majority of the Armada remained in formation. This was not a disarrayed retreat which had to be done at Jupiter. It was a calculated assessment of odds, and the choice had been made that Mars's proud soldiers would have to abandon their homes so that they could live to fight another day. Yet, something felt off to Hector. "The bulk of the fleet is active," the sergeant said as he glanced outside. "Why are we retreating?" Far beyond the visual scope of things, a seething swarm of bio-vessels had ceased their engagement with the fleet and began to cling to the planet. Some of them even entered the atmosphere, descending upon the red world in droves, mainly the now abandoned settled areas. "There was just too damn many of them," Captain Warren sighed, his mechanical eyes fixed upon the battle group within the human fleet. It was only a small bit, but what was noticeable was the presence of the super battleship South America that stood at the head of the formation. Unlike the other ships, it plowed straight into the alien fleet. Warren could only picture what was going on inside the heads of the crewmen. There would be no retreat for them. "Don't you worry, though, assuming if they make it to Earth at all, we've got basically the entire MDF and EDF combined to take them on. That's one battle they will not win." "Not make it to Earth, huh? If we're turning tail and fleeing, how don't they make it to Earth?" Warren remained silent as the ship trudged on. He doubted Hector would see it from the distance, but the sight of the laser trails of the bioplasma firing from the tiny blips told him all he knew. South America had made contact with the enemy. Her hull had been loaded with maybe thousands of nuclear warheads. When Saturn Fleet had identified the presence of a massive alien ship that was likely some kind of command or mothership, Ross knew what had to be done. The sacrifice of one of Earth's prized super battleships was no easy thing. Each one of those titans had constructed with the care and pride of a people who had wanted to solidify their dominion upon the stars. Each one of those Orcs held the lives of countless thousands of men and women who had agreed to a one-way trip for just so Earth could have a fighting chance. It was heartbreaking. He felt hot tears stinging from his non-mechanical eye. But his answer came when the explosion came. In such enormity, even Hector, who possessed no cybernetics, saw it clear as day, as the fireball stretched on for what was thousands of kilometers, so great that portions of Mars would be irreparably devastated by the blast. There was no telling how many alien vessels were destroyed, but worse yet, there was no telling it worked. In the best-case scenario, the aliens would be like ants. The death of a queen would be like the death of their hive. In the worst-case scenario, all it did was briefly paralyze the chain of command these creatures had. If there was even a chain of command. Unable to shake that feeling of dread that still persisted in his human half, Warren pointed over to the explosion. At the very least, a lot of bugs must have died in that blast. That's how. End of story. I would quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and Patreons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, Lord Azrakal, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Dragzoon WRE, Holly's Sister, Arcadian. Thank you very much.